All right, so today our math goal is to compare the values of digits using our place value. So write down everything you know about comparing digits and their value, and then come back to me. Make sure you write this down on your math notebook, please. All right, so we're going to look at decimals and their equivalents, what's equal. Um, Read each decimal, which decimals are equivalent, which are greater, which are less. So let's start with equivalents, okay? So look at this chart and see if you can figure out which decimals are equal to each other. And then come back to me, and then we'll talk about which ones are greater and which ones are less. All right, well, if you said that the rows going down, they're all equivalent to each other, you'd be correct. So let's look at the example here. 5/10, right? That's the same thing as 5 out of 10, which is half. 5/100, or not 5/100, 50/100 is the same thing as 50 out of 100. So that's also equal to a half. And then we have 500 out of 1,000. So 500 out of 1,000, because it's in the thousands place, is also equal to a half. So all these are equal to a half. They're equivalent fractions, okay? So the same thing with any of these rows. If I were to pick 2/10, that's also equivalent to 20 over 100, or 200 over 1,000. They're all equivalent. So what I want you to notice from this chart, that after the number, you can put as many zeros as you want and it doesn't change the number. The numbers are the same. These are all worth a half. They're all the same. So remember this, you can put as many zeros as you want after the number, after the decimal, and it doesn't really matter. It doesn't make a difference. So now let's talk about which ones are greater and which ones are less. So pause the video and see if you can figure it out. Okay, so hopefully you said that the greater ones are on the right. So this is the biggest, right? The whole. And the smallest, well, it's down here on the left-hand side, right? These are the less, because it's just 1/10. These are all 1/10. These are all 3/10. Okay, so hopefully you figured that out. So an example here, 6/10 is the same thing as 0.60, as the same thing as 0.600, because 6 out of 10 equal parts is equal to 60 out of 100 equal parts, which is the same thing as 600 out of 1,000 equal parts. All right. So in your math notebook, write that down. Write down that you can add as many zeros as you want after the number, and it does not make a difference. I could add 100 zeros here. I could write 1,000 zeros after. It doesn't matter. It doesn't change the number. So write that down in your math notebook, because that's really, really, really important. And if you want to write this example here, that would be great. If not, you can use my half example that I went through, and that would be great, because that's really going to help you for this. All right, so now that we know equivalent decimals, doesn't matter how many zeros I add at the end after the number, that's going to help us, because then we can find equal decimals. So how else can we compare decimals? Greater and less than, right? Or greater and less than signs. So let's look at some of these. So how are we going to compare these? Which ones are greater, less than, or equal? So let's look. 6/10 and 28/100. Now you're saying, why is 6/10 bigger, Mrs. Holguin? Why isn't 28/100? You have hundreds here, but you remember this is 28 out of 100 if we write it in fraction form. And this is 6 out of 10 if we write it in fraction form. So you have 6 out of 10, that's going to be bigger than 28 out of 100, because here you have more than half. Here you have way less than half, right? So what do? We compare the digit that's right after the decimal. So this is 6/10. It's bigger than 2 tenths. So 6 tenths is bigger. So start comparing for the number right after the decimal. Now let's look at this one. It's the same thing, right? Because remember I told you it doesn't matter how many zeros you add. I can ignore that zero. It's still my 6 tenths and it's still my 2800s. This is still bigger, right? Or think of it this way. If I want to leave it, I could put 60 out of 100, right? It'd be 60 out of 100, or 28 out of 100. Which one's bigger? Well, obviously 60 over 100 is more than 28 out of 100, okay? And again, same thing, it doesn't matter. It's still the 6 tenths is still bigger than 28 hundredths, the same thing. And again, if I write it the opposite way, it still doesn't matter. It's still the same thing. So it's still 6 tenths versus 28 hundredths. So the same thing. All right. Okay, so let's try some. Let's compare using the decimals. Let's compare these decimals. So I have 4 tenths, 4 out of 10, or 40 out of 100. They are equal, right? Because it doesn't matter how many zeros I add at the end. 4 out of 10 is the same thing as 40 out of 100. They are equal. I'm comparing right next to my decimal. So now this one, let's look at this one. This is telling me that I have 3 things out of 100, 3 out of 100. This is telling me I have 3 out of 10. So which one's bigger? Well, if obviously 3 out of 10, right? Because I'm split up into less pieces. Now, if you looked at the other logic, like I was telling you, look at the first number after the decimal. This is a 0. This is a 3. What's bigger? A 3 is bigger than a 0, right? I'm comparing the tenths and the tenths. Because remember, in decimals, the tenths is bigger than the hundredths, and it's bigger than the thousands. Remember, our decimal tenths is bigger than hundredths, than thousands. Thousands is our smallest. All right, so let's compare this one. I have 5. Notice I don't have a decimal, so that means I have 5 wholes. So what's bigger, 5 whole things or 5 out of 10? Well, obviously, 5 whole things is bigger. So don't let it throw you off. There's no decimal, so it's 5 wholes and 5 tenths. All right, let's try some more. Let's compare. So again, I'm going to use my strategy. I'm going to compare my tenths first. My tenths, I have a 7. My tenths, I have a 7. Oh, they must be equal because it doesn't matter. Remember, I learned it doesn't matter. I can add as many zeros as I want. It doesn't matter. It's still the same thing. So let's try this one. Okay, I have a 0 in the tenths. I have a 0 in the tenths. So that's not going to help me. So let's look at the hundredths. I have a 7 in the hundredths, a 7 in the hundredths. So they are equal. It doesn't matter if I have a 0 here. I could add zeros here as many as I wanted, and it would make a difference, okay? All right, let's look at this one. 10th spot, I have a 0. 10th spot, I have a 7. So what's bigger? 7 tenths is bigger than 7 thousandths, because remember this is 7 out of 1,000. And this is 7 out of 10. So I have a pizza cut up into 10 pieces. I'm getting 7. Here a pizza cut up into 1,000 pieces, and I'm only getting 7. So obviously this one is bigger. All right, you try some now. Compare the decimals using greater, less than, or equal, and then come back to me. All right, so 6 tenths is the same thing as 60 out of 100, right? They are equal. It doesn't matter how many zeros. I could add 0 here. I could put a 0 here, and they'd be equal. All right, I compared this one. 6 tenths is bigger than 6 hundredths, because remember, this is like 60 out of 100, and this is 6 out of 100. So which one's bigger? 60 out of 100. I compared the tenths, so that one is bigger. Now, this one is tricky, boys and girls. So let's see if you got fooled or not. So 111 thousandths is actually bigger than 11 hundredths. So think about it this way. This is 111 out of 1,000. This is 11 out of 100. And think about it this way. I could add a 0 here, right? Because it doesn't matter. Now I can compare, and now I can see I have 111 out of 1,000. this would be 110 out of 1,000. So 111 is bigger. All right, try some more. Make sure you're writing these down in your math notebook, then come back to me and we will check our answers. All right, so 21 hundredths is bigger than 2/10. I could add a 0 here and then I can easily compare, right? Because I have a 2 in the 10th spot in each. But if I add a 0 here, because remember I can add as many zeros as I want, I know that 1 is bigger than 0. 5/10 is the same thing as 5/10. So 50 out of 100 is the same thing as 5 out of 10. So they are equal. I could add a 0 here and I could say that they are equal because I have a 5 in the 10th spot in both places. Okay, this one I have a 3 in the 10th and I have a 2 in the 10th. So which one's bigger? Well, obviously the 3, right? I could add a 0 here to make it easier for you to compare. That would be 30 out of 100 or 29 out of 100. Which one's bigger? 30 out of 100 is bigger. All right, so we come to the end of our math lesson. What did you learn today? Write it down. Proof of learning by solving a problem similar to the ones we did, a reflection or a question you may have. And that is it for today.